Let's get joined up. Today's show is brought to you by Audible, and right now you can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/joined up. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. So thanks for tuning in to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, a regular show about all things writing, including interviews with authors, screenwriters, and key figures from the publishing industry. Plus loads of hints, tips, and inspiration for all creatives. You can follow us on Twitter at JU Podcast, leave a quick iTunes review, or just tell a friend.
Joined Up Writing.
Hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly and it's episode 150 with Nonfiction author Greg Milner, who wrote the excellent Perfecting Sound Forever and Pinpoint. He's also got experience in journalism and writing for magazines, so aside from all the music stuff, we had plenty of writing related things to chat about as well. And one of the things that Greg talks about is the fact that when it comes to writing, and I suppose a lot of other things in life, nobody really knows what they're doing, and it's definitely something that I can relate to of late. You might recall that last week I talked about the most recent feedback I'd had for my novel, Safe Hands, and the fact that I was pretty ready to just put it back in the metaphorical drawer and throw away the key, because it's clear that my main character just isn't connecting with readers, at least in those early existing chapters. And what was interesting is that some of you heard the despondent tone in my voice and very kindly got in touch to try to stop me from giving up on it just yet. In particular, regular listeners Jim and Pat, thank you both, had similar things to say on why perhaps I'm being a little bit premature with it. Jim has already had the pleasure of reading the book, but Pat was brave enough to take on the challenge too and has now read those early chapters. And his feedback chimes perfectly with much of the previous feedback I've had, but for some reason, the way that he expressed it, or maybe it was some of the specifics that he picked out, some things finally made the penny drop for me, and I think I now know what I need to do to fix things. And as with a lot of critique, it's often not the specific feedback that tells you where the real issues, but it lets you know that there's a bigger problem and it just gets your wheels turning again. And that's what's happened for me now. So yes, my main character is failing to connect in these first chapters, but the reasons are multifaceted. Firstly, I'm not giving away enough of what he's actually thinking. He comes across as being this super confident, aggressive, cocksure bloke. But inside he's in turmoil, and I know this, and it becomes more apparent as the book progresses, but I've clearly failed to get that across in this draft, and that's on me. But secondly, the whole thing has led me to an even bigger revelation. I've started the book in the wrong place. That's the real problem. Through redrafting, I've already cut a lot from the beginning, but I now realise I'm still starting the story too early, and I'm trying to cram in too much backstory too quickly. I think I know where I now need to start the book, and I think it's going to make a big difference to the start and how readers feel about my protagonist. Bottom line, for the first time in ages, I'm actually excited to get back to the novel. So tune in next week to Wayne's Fickle Fortunes, where I change my mind yet again. I could just lie and pretend it's all going swimmingly, but where's the fun in that? And I'm sure lots of you feel the same about your projects. So anyway, I'd love to hear what's going on with you, so do please get in touch. And you can do that by tweeting me at JU Podcast, emailing Wayne at WayneKellyWrites.com, or dropping me a line on the FB page. Also, don't forget to join the email mailing list at joinedupwriting.co.uk. Totally free, and you get a couple of free downloadable goodies when you sign up, and you'll be the first to find out about upcoming shows and events. Right, let's get to today's interview, a chat with Greg Milner. Writer and editor with over 2 decades of experience, with a recent focus on geospatial issues. His latest book, Pinpoint, How GPS is Changing Technology, Culture and Our Minds, was named a Best Book of 2016 by Wired, the Financial Times, the Sunday Times and Strategy+Business. I only recently finished his first book, Perfecting Sound Forever, an aural history of recorded music, and I loved it. That book was a finalist in the National Book Critics Circle Awards, and both of his books are out right now everywhere you can find good books. So enjoy the chat, and I'll pop back at the end to wrap things up.
Joined up writing.
Okay, Greg, thanks a million for joining me on Joined Up Writing. Really appreciate it. So why don't you just start off just giving us a sense of where you're actually speaking from and how things are going at the minute for you?
I'm right now speaking from my fairly new home in Portland, Oregon, USA. Moved here from Brooklyn about 3 months ago. And so things are going okay for me, just sort of like still a little bit chaotic.
Yeah. Bit quieter than Brooklyn, presumably?
Yeah, eerily quiet.
Somebody that's from New York. I should imagine it's a big culture change, is it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually from Hawaii originally, but I lived in New York for a long time, and I thought it would be. I kind of thought it would just feel like kind of coming home, being back on the West Coast, because Hawaii is sort of like that, but it feels. It's a weird. I don't know. It's still a little discombobulated.
You'll get there. You'll change. Well, as I say, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. And how I came into contact with your work, as I think I mentioned before, was I came across your first book, which was Perfecting Sound Forever, an Aural History of Recorded Music, which I highly recommend to listeners. It's brilliant. I really enjoyed it. So maybe just start by just telling, for people that don't know about that book, tell us what that book is and sort of how it came about, why you came to write it.
Sure. And by the way, thank you for the kind words. I'm glad you enjoyed the book.
Yeah, it was great. I loved it.
The book is a history of recording technology in a sense, but it's really more about the history of the idea of what exactly a sound recording is supposed to be. You know, what qualities should it embody, and how do we discuss what those qualities are, and how do we sort of, in a way, fight it out, throughout the ages about, what a recording should be. It came about originally like a long, long time ago. I was actually in graduate school for anthropology, and I wrote a master's thesis on the transition from analog to digital technologies in the recording industry, kind of an anthropology of art type of project. And that got me thinking about, whether that sort of battle, was actually played out earlier on, and if there was a larger sweep to the story, and that maybe what I was studying was actually just the latest incarnation of a larger debate.
Yeah, well, as I say, it's really interesting. It's kind of one of those things where it kind of makes sense that you were thinking about it for something like that, like a thesis or something, because it doesn't seem like the kind of thing that would just. It's something that we take for granted, recorded sound, especially our generation, as you kind of allude to in the book. It's kind of so ubiquitous now. This sound and this music is everywhere. Recorded music is everywhere. It's kind of like wallpaper almost. So to kind of think why, or even if it does sound any different now to how when it was first recorded and all those sort of things, I thought it was great. So when you it's one thing going from a thesis to thinking I'll write a book about it. So did you have to pitch the book before you wrote it, or did you just write it and then shop it around? Was it kind of a tough sell?
No, actually, one of the nice things about being a nonfiction writer is that you don't have to write the whole book before. There's an idea. I dropped out of graduate school and I worked as a journalist for several years in music journalism. I was a freelancer and I worked as an editor for Spin magazine for a while. And I wanted to write something like that, not for an academic audience at all, but for more like a popular audience and more tell a story with it. So I, kind of stewed about it for several years, and kind of being a music journalist in a way helped me conceive the book because of what I wasn't doing. I always felt like, even when I was reviewing records, that a lot of times we were all kind of missing the point, that we were discussing songs without discussing really what the sounds were behind them and what the assumptions were about why those sounds should exist. So I started to put together a book proposal, and it was not, in a sense, it wasn't that difficult to sell. There were a few people who were interested in it. It's once I found an agent and pitched it around to some publishers, there wasn't like a big frenzy for it. I mean, it was considered a very niche-y book in a way.
Yeah.
The small audience for it, but the people who got it were really enthusiastic about it. So it became kind of a labor of love, because the people who were willing to publish it, it's not like they were willing to throw millions of dollars at me. It's more like they just thought, wow, if someone wants to do this book, great.
Yeah, sure. Go and have a go at it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a huge topic. So how did you decide which parts of the story you wanted to tell?
Well, I figured I should start at the beginning, which is Thomas Edison.
Mm-hmm.
So I just started researching him, and I discovered that in a funny way he was almost like an A&R guy for he had his own record label in a way, and the phonograph was really one of his. It was the invention that he felt most sort of personally connected to. I mean, he really was fascinated by the phonograph and what it could mean. So I started there, but in a way, something else that actually really got me going, although I didn't discover this, I think, until a few months into researching the book, and I don't even remember how I discovered it, but the idea of sound recording sounds very complicated, but it actually is very simple, and it's something that could have been invented, by the ancient Greeks, or for example. You just don't need that much to make a sound recording. You just need a few very simple implements and materials. So it's almost like it made me realize like sound recording came into being at a time when people sort of had the inclination that they needed it to sort of describe life, not just music, but like how they saw life. And so Edison was very, very, he had a very, very specific philosophy. He believed, for example, in acoustic recording. I'll give a very simple definition for people who are listening. Acoustic recording is just, the sound essentially making sound vibrations, making an impression on a waxy material. And then those, some sort of stylus plays, goes through those grooves again, and it recreates those vibrations, and you've got the sound recreated. Now that sounds like hopelessly ancient, but what happened with Edison is, after a while, people started, inventing electrical recording, and that's what we all understand recording to be, right? There's a microphone turning sound waves into electrical impulses, and those become the vibrations. And Edison thought that was really crazy. He really felt that acoustic recording was the future because it was something where you really were taking the sound direct from the source and putting it down, and then giving it back in a sort of pure form. To him, the microphone was just mediating this pure sound with this kind of corruption. And as an implication of that, he felt that what a recording should be is really just recording of pure music itself, as opposed to the recording of a piece of music the way it sounds in the specific room it's being played in, which again is what the microphone could do, right? It could give you room and stuff. He thought that was crazy because what he felt like is that when you listen to music live, you're actually getting all kinds of corruptions. You're not getting the pure idea of the music. So his idea was that you should really just record the music right from the source, right onto the wax, no ambient sound, nothing, and that would be the future. And of course, he was disproven in a massive way, and his record, his music went out of business. Edison was deaf pretty much by the time the phonograph got going, but he felt that actually made him a better listener because he
I thought that was funny actually in the book.
He'd bite into the wood and feel the vibrations, and his point was, well, they're going directly to my inner ear because I'm deaf, and so he felt that was what the sound recording could be. It could present music in a way that was purer than the way it sounded when you heard it live. And I realized that, okay, that's a sort of argument right there. What, this difference between Edison and acoustic recording and Berliner and electrical recording is kind of an argument over an idea of, what it's like to make a piece of music. If it's that you should record just the sound, or if it's that you record the room. And that debate, for example, got, recreated many years later in the idea of whether in the 70s, whether recordings should be super dry or not, no ambience at all, versus this idea of capturing live sound. So it was just kind of one thing led to another. And I just kind of had sort of operated on faith that the more I looked, the more I'd find stuff. But I'd also been thinking about these things for so long that in a kind of perverse way, I had the book all written in my head. I just had to find things to support what I knew was out there.
It's kind of bursting to get out. It just seems to me that it's an incredibly difficult subject to write about, in the fact that, as you kind of alluded to and what you've just talked about, it's It's sound. So it's, it's noises, and you're kind of you're trying to describe how this is, and it's how we hear music as well. It's sort of one of those things that we kind of take for granted. So were there kind of other books, maybe they were fiction, maybe they were non-fiction, or other articles before that had kind of inspired you in terms of the style and the way that you wanted to approach it and how you wanted to talk about it? Did you find it was difficult when you actually started getting into, because obviously I know you'd been doing it and you'd been reviewing records, but as you rightly pointed out, often when you're reviewing a song or something, you're not necessarily talking about the sound and the very specific instruments and all the rest of it.
Yeah, it was. I mean, there's that famous quote that it's never clear who should be attributed to about, writing about music is like dancing about architecture.
Yeah.
It's a great quote, even though I can see people dancing about architecture. It doesn't seem.
People have probably done it already.
Yeah, exactly. But writing about sound it's a very, very difficult thing because, it's something that's kind of out there, and it's sort of hard to apprehend. So, yeah, it was difficult to write about that. I mean, I always tell people, if you want to be practice writing, try reviewing records. I really feel like it's something that, actually really forces you to try to communicate some very complicated concepts, even if you don't realize that that's what you're doing. I think around that time when I wrote the book, it hadn't been so long since I had read City of Quartz by Mike Davis, The History of Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And in a way, that book really inspired me, first of all, because the writing is fantastic. He's just a great stylist, but also the way he took this incredibly huge topic, like how do you approach the history of Southern California, one of the biggest metro areas in the USA, and actually communicate very complex things about what it means, especially because he was a native in a way of LA. So it was a very personal account. Mm-hmm. And to me, when I was writing Perfecting Sound Forever, I realized that there were going to be so many things I was going to leave out of the book. But what I wanted to do is sort of talk about things that moved me personally. I always tell people some of your favorite, important artists are not mentioned in this book. It's and it's, you should know that going in. But so it became, in a weird way, even though that book is not, about music, it really became a way for me to do that. In terms of music books, I was really, really into John Savage's England's Dreaming, because it's just it takes this sort of sweep of history and talking about the history of punk and just, does something really beautiful with it. I think at the time, I can't remember, this probably came out while I was working on the book, but Simon Reynolds' Rip It Up and Start Again, which also just impressed me because he took this vague topic, what is post-punk anyway, and defined it as he saw it, and then found the thread that runs through lots of different kinds of music. And I realized as I was reading it that the writing was great because I actually was turning the page to find out what happened to Haircut 100 with their neck.
Yeah.
They really, really care. So that and Robert Christgau and Grail Marcus are also, two music writers who I really took a lot from, and just in a way, kind of their fearlessness in just sort of asserting opinions and, not being afraid to try to back them up.
So one of the as an example of one of the techniques that you kind of employ early on was you kind of zoom into minute detail to John Bonham playing a drum part for Led Zepp, and you literally following the sound waves into the ear canal of the listener, and it's really effective. And it's probably like a technique that you might normally associate more with fiction. So what made you adopt that kind of style, and do you have kind of any aspirations to get into writing fiction, or have you written any fiction?
That's, in a way, I'm flattered you'd ask the question, because that was exactly I was taking this topic that was kind of esoteric. Music books are a niche to begin with, right? And this was something that was really kind of asking a lot of people to try to care of this. So I felt like there had to be some kind of narrative force to it. There had to be a story, and and one way, of course, to start the story is to start by zooming right in. It's almost cinematic, and then pulling back and seeing them. So that was my thing. That was definitely my thinking. That was, I think a lot of long form nonfiction writers, in a way, maybe have a little chip on their shoulder because, or maybe feel a little insecure because they feel like, novelists are the people who are considered the real writers and the real stylists. And I've thought about writing fiction. I've never really done it, but I wanted to sort of make this feel like a story, feel like a narrative, like that there's a beginning, and that by the time you get to the end of the book, you feel like, wow, I've really actually like traveled through something. And which is the way you feel, I think, when you write, when you read a good novel, or especially with a film, or even a more apt example, I think, is a TV series that you think is great. I'm sure at the time I'd seen The Wire at that point, and I'm not comparing my stuff to that amazing piece, but the same sort of thing where it starts small, right? It's about Baltimore, drug trade, and then pulls out, and you realize it's actually about the entire city and how the drug trade, in a way, seeps into so many things. So
and society at large, and all the different themes. And it's the same goes with that. You've effectively got recurring characters throughout the story that you're telling as well, that you're kind of coming back, that keep popping up at various different times, and we kind of follow their journey as well. So it's obviously really, really effective. So the subject of research comes up on this podcast quite a lot when people are talking about writing novels. But for the kind of books that you write, the task of research must be huge. I mean, the amount of research that must have gone into just that book, let alone before we talk about the book that came after that. But so give us a sense of how you tackle research. Do you spend lots of time doing it before you do any of the actual writing, or do you tend to start writing and then do a bit more research, and then start writing and do a bit more research? How do you tackle it?
I tend to do the research first because it's a way to really procrastinate from the hard task.
That's what I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah, well, feeling like you're actually doing it. And it's true, you need to know, like, you need to do research. I always say, like, the best, I usually go chapter by chapter, and the best feeling is the sort of middle part where you've done enough research where you can see a chapter kind of coming into focus, but you're not trying to write it yet.
Yeah.
And it's just, I usually start with the research. It just kind of like, it's hard to explain how you do that. I mean, at the time I was fortunate to be living in New York, because the New York Public Library has so many great resources. And so, like, I was using they have a special performing arts library, and I was doing a lot of work there. But it's just a matter of, in a way, like, if I think a lot of nonfiction writers maybe also have certain mild forms of ADHD, where and I found in research it kind of pays to let that impulse flow a little bit, like go on something and like, wait, that reminds me of something else. Let me look at this, and then okay, that can tie together. I mean, I read this. I wish I could remember who said it, but there was this great quote about Melville and Moby Dick, and something like, he could never write that book today because he would just be spending all his time Googling the word whale.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the way it felt with this. The hardest part, in a way, with research was trying to figure out who to interview in the present, because I wanted to talk to as many people as possible, especially if I wanted this to feel like a work of journalism, and as a long form nonfiction, as opposed to a dry academic novel. So that, in a way, was the hardest part. I couldn't afford a research assistant, although I think I briefly hired someone just to help me transcribe tapes, because I was building up. So, and by the way, back then I was still doing my recording on actual cassettes, which is funny. I bought lots of them because I didn't trust digital recorders back then. I briefly had one, and it
they were a bit rubbish at the beginning. I remember as you say, they could just stop or record over things and stuff.
Yeah, it was so exactly. So it's that feeling of just sort of just jumping in. And now that everything is online, in a way, research is a lot easier. Back then, a lot of stuff I would have to go to a library to look to find out, or I'd have to try to order music, off, like eBay or whatever that I found important for me to hear. Especially when I was writing, the book touches a little bit on classical and jazz things, but I stayed away from that for the most part, because I wanted to keep this book feeling personal and make it feeling like stuff that I was already immersed in.
Yeah. And so you were kind of following. And I suppose if, as you say, I know what you're saying, it is easier online, but then I also think it's probably easier to get lost down rabbit holes if you're doing it all online, whereas I should imagine it's not as easy to do that if you're actually taking books and articles off the shelf and actually reading them.
Yeah, absolutely. Or if you're interviewing people, I mean, interviewing people really makes you focus. And in a funny way, I discovered early on that interviewing people, I almost never, and to this day, I pretty much do the same thing. I almost never write interview questions. I usually just maybe jot down a few keywords or concepts, and because then you're really forced to have a conversation with people, and that can really focus you, especially if it's going in and talking about something that I knew nothing about. Okay, so I'm going to interview people about mixing boards, and how in the 70s, the number of tracks just exploded and what that meant, and so. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's when everything is online, it's almost too easy.
And what did the people, your interviewees, what did they think about the project when you explained it and said, I want to come and talk to you about this? What were their thoughts on it?
I almost universally, like enthusiasm. I mean, these people don't, especially when I interview because I interview some musicians, and they never get to talk about stuff this way. And recording engineers are hardly ever, to begin with. But one thing I discovered, and this is really true across the board, and it's hard to say this without sounding condescending, like I didn't have many expectations, but recording engineers are incredibly articulate people, and some of the most articulate people I've ever met in describing their work. And I think it's because they're forced daily to try to articulate this ideas about this thing that really kind of exists in the air.
Yeah, I was going to say that, and they're kind of they're a conduit, aren't they, between the producer and the artist, and often that's difficult in itself. You've got an artist saying, "I want it to sound like whatever," cue vague description, and the same goes for the producer to a certain extent. Because I often talk about this I've got a friend that's a musician, and we talk about it. And engineers in general do get really, really overlooked. I know they're kind of not necessarily in the industry, people know who the great engineers are, but I think in the wider public, we talk lots about producers, but we don't really talk about engineers, and yet they're the ones that are kind of deciding where mics go and how many tracks you spend on you put on a drum or anything else, and they're such a big part of it.
Yeah, it's exactly. I mean, it blurs a little bit because it's the difference between a musician and an engineer has really become blurred because so many musicians can engineer their own stuff. But yeah, I mean, a very stark example of that is, I talk about the Beatles a bit in the book, and how what they were doing was kind of mirroring what was happening when recording at large as their records changed. And I talk about Jeff Emmerich, their long engineer, a fair amount. And I think I mentioned George Martin maybe once. And I noticed that when I read the final manuscript, I thought, okay, this is because, Beatles people it's kind of like when you write a book about World War II. I've heard you really have to make sure you don't get anything wrong because they're those crazy World War II. And that's the way it is with the Beatles. And I noticed then I was like, oh, the way this kind of developed, I really just talked about the engineer. I really haven't talked about George Martin. But you know what? Actually, I think that's the story here because, George Martin was the one who had to go and tell him, okay, well, John Lennon wants it to sound like,
exactly,
a cow, mooing or whatever.
Yeah.
I got to figure out, okay, let's maybe put this microphone here in a Leslie speaker. And
yeah, that's what I always like about because funny enough, at the minute I'm listening to an audiobook, the Beatles, I think it's called 1, 2, 3, 4, is it? Or something, tune in, 1, 2, 3, 4, something like that. And it kind of jumps all over the place. But yeah, that comes across a lot. Jeff Emmerich's quoted quite a lot in it, and he kind of does come across as just a really, really pragmatic kind of, roll his eyes at the crazy suggestion and then work out the practical way to do it. They're basically problem solvers a lot of the time, aren't they?
Yeah, and it's funny I don't know if you've ever read Jeff Emmerich's memoir, but it's actually a really good book, and he really has all these negative thoughts about the White Album, mainly because it was such an unpleasant thing to have to work. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah,
at the time when they all hated each other, and it was in the Hayes, he has nothing but negative memories of that. But yeah, it's by the way, if it's quick aside, I don't know if you've read it, but if the best Beatles book I've ever read, and full disclosure, I mean I know the author, but Rob Sheffield's Dreaming the Beatles is just fantastic.
Oh no, I haven't read that. That sounds good.
Yeah, it's a really it's a unique book in that it's basically kind of a history, but in the form of essays that you don't even realize you're looking at the history of that. Yeah. So yeah, I recommend that highly.
Yeah, that sounds good. So, okay, well, let's take a step back for a second, from that book specifically. So tell us a little bit about your background. You've kind of hinted at some of it, but give us a sense of where you grew up and what your earliest memory of writing was, or is, should I say.
God, that's a good question. The earliest memory of writing is, I mean, I got to think of this. I was born in a small town in Iowa, but I mostly grew up in Hawaii. And so I can remember, it's growing up in Hawaii is an interesting experience if you're a white person like me. It's one of the few places you can grow up and feel like you're a minority, because you are, because everyone's a minority there.
Yeah.
And I'm Jewish, so that was like a kind of a minority.
You're doubling down on it. Yeah.
Yeah, really, exactly. So I think just trying to make sense of this real kind of, you hear a lot about the melting pot, and Hawaii is really the melting pot, or the salad bowl, as in, if you prefer that metaphor. So I can't remember exactly when I first started writing. The first thing I wrote, I can remember. This is going on. And when I was in high school, I had an internship at the University of Hawaii newspaper, and I wrote a review of the Pretenders album. What's it called? Is it called Get Close? Anyway, the fact that I can't even remember the name of it is kind of proves the point, because I thought it was a negligible album. And I wrote it in a way that I'd been reading, like record reviews for so long, for several years since then. I thought, I can do this. And I wrote it, and the editors loved it, and it got published, and it was just such an amazing feeling. I thought, oh, I can do this. I know how to review records.
That's kind of how you got into it.
Yeah, in a way. I mean, that was sort of like, I can remember looking at records early on and trying to figure out, like, what does this mean? How did they do this? I thought that when you listen to, like, say, an album side, you were hearing the musicians doing the songs live in that order. Yeah. And so I figure out, like, as a little kid, like, but wait, how is John Paul Jones playing the mandolin here if he's also playing bass? So that was it. So I kind of always, my earliest thing was that I wanted to be some sort of like critic. My family subscribed to the New Yorker, and back then it was like impenetrable for a kid, but I could read Pauline Kael, her movie reviews and stuff. Yeah, so that really, and Stanley Kaufman in the New Republic, because we also got that. So it was also thinking about movies that, actually in a way helped kind of grow the seed in my mind.
So the analytical thing was kind of the thing that probably appealed to you without realizing that that's necessarily what it was.
Yeah, exactly. This right. That's the fact that, I think I like the idea of essays, even though I wasn't really thinking of it in those terms.
Taking those things apart. So at what point did that go from, oh, that was kind of a fun thing to do, or like, as you say, critiquing music or whatever? What point did that change to you maybe thinking, well, actually, there might be a bit of a career in this, or I could maybe do this, I could look at how I could make a living doing this?
Well, I've yet to actually think that, but
you and most of the writers, yeah.
I look forward to the day when I can think. I got out of university, and I moved to San Francisco for a while, and I managed to get hooked up with people at the SF Weekly, which was then one of the alternative weeklies in the Bay Area. There were about 3 or 4 at the time, and writing for alt weeklies was, I got some record reviews in there. That was really good training, and I feel like writers today don't really have that, because they start writing online and they don't really have editors. That's but to, to write for 10 cents a word with editors who really expect you to get it right and say something interesting was, I was fortunate. My first editor was Evelyn McDonnell, who I think now is the dean of the journalism program at Loyola University in LA, I think. Mm-hmm. And she was a Village Voice person. And that was huge for me, because when I was in university, reading the Village Voice was just huge. And it's, once I was there I had the, in retrospect, really dumb idea to try to go to graduate school. And, I grew up in an academic family. My father is now retired, but he's a poli-sci professor at the University of Hawaii. And I thought, oh, I can do this. I mean, I'd written about music as an anthropology major. I'd written for the college newspaper, but I also did, my graduate thesis, on that before I even went to graduate school. I wrote it on music. So there was that. But once I got out, I just, I was in New York, and that's where a lot of the music writers were. And I was very fortunate in that someone who started out with me at the SF Weekly just like a freelancer like me, although I think she had an internship there, Saya Michael, was now working, at Spin, and she helped magazine. She helped me, get a job there first as a fact checker, and then I managed to work my way up. And she's now, I think, the arts editor for the New York Times. So she's gone far, and I was actually very lucky to have editors along the way who really helped me out. And so when I became an editor at Spin, I realized, oh, okay, this is something that you can actually do sort of for a living if you're lucky. And I was very, very lucky. I mean, I worked hard at it, but I was very fortunate to be in the right place at the right time.
So what sorts of lessons, you talked about working your way up there, and presumably when you were handing in your first pieces, submitting your first pieces in different bits and pieces, what were some of the hardest lessons that you kind of had to learn early on, would you say?
The hardest thing was that you had to, not dumb it down, but you had to write for the correct audience.
Mm-hmm.
So Spin, you had to write a certain way. It's getting the style of different publications can be a real challenge when you're starting out, but it's one of the most important things you can do. So trying to get that voice right was difficult, I think, at times. Also being able to write about anything. I mean, the funny thing about Spin at the time is the music that most of the readers liked, I think, were basically detested by the editors and the main writer. And they have to put Limp Bizkit on the cover, but everyone hates Limp Bizkit. So you have this weird thing where everyone wanted to be totally snarky about them, but you couldn't really be absolutely snarky about them because the readers actually like them. Yeah. So that was sort of a hard balance.
You had to just slip the odd thing in under the radar.
Yeah, exactly. And also, it was a struggle to find out that the stuff that I was interested in wasn't necessarily what other people were interested in. I mean, I managed to write about things that I thought were interesting about the weirdness of the music business, for example, and strange little aspects of it. But that I had to sort of work hard to get that in as small pieces in the front of the book, as we say in the magazine world, the small parts before the features. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that was hard.
And did you, in terms of the actual writing, what sort of notes did you get back early on? Was it a case of, was it cutting words? Was it, what sort of feedback did you get on those early things that you were submitting?
It was usually you need things have to be much clearer here. You have to actually explain what you mean. This quote here doesn't really explain what the person is saying well enough. So you have to augment, you have to actually have a lead into that quote, those kind of things. I mean, one thing that I discovered early on, because as I became an editor at Spin, they also had me doing a lot of writing, and I tell this to this day, is if you do several drafts of something, it's probably going to be pretty good, or at least something that the editor isn't going to roll their eyes at and just be really irritated that they now have to take this thing apart and put it back together. So learning the way things should be structured and really working hard on making things as clear as possible was really, was a good learning. It's a good life lesson in a way, and trying to do that. So those are the kind of comments that I remember getting back. Just be clearer.
And so, obviously, we talked about your first book. So your second book was kind of, again, taking something that most of us by this stage, again, probably just totally take for granted, GPS, and your book Pinpoint. So tell us just a little bit about that, how that came about, because again, it's on the face of it, it's an unusual thing to tackle.
Yeah, it's sort of what I always end up tackling is these unusual things. I was, Perfecting Sound Forever had been out for a while, and I was doing various things. I mean, I actually got a job as a political speechwriter for a while, but I knew I wanted to write another book. And I just started noticing things about GPS. It was the kind of thing it was around the time when GPS chips were now on our phones, so we all had GPS. But no one even seemed to really even know what GPS was. Was it a specific technology? Was it something just that, a catch-all term for navigation technologies? And also around that time, this photo started being circulated that was taken from Google Maps Street View that people noticed a certain street corner in Manhattan. And by the way, I knew this street corner very well because it was where there was a high-end audio store on that I had visited, when writing. But the Google car driving by just happened to catch someone lying on the street surrounded by people. It's a really eerie photo. And of course, as soon as Google realized that it was out there, they wiped it and replaced it with another photo of the same intersection. But it was this incredible photo because you were looking at this. It looked like maybe someone was dying.
Just a moment in time, yeah.
And I knew that somehow GPS was implicated in this, that this couldn't exist without GPS. Mm-hmm. But so we were given this window into this very intimate moment with no context whatsoever. So those two things, seeing that photo and also looking at GPS and realizing that we all had it, but nobody really knew what it was. And as I researched it, I realized, oh, okay, this is something actually owned by the United States Air Force, or really owned by the Pentagon and administered by the Air Force. And as I peeled the layers away, I just discovered more and more things about it. In a way, I saw it as it was weird as it sounds, I saw it as a companion to Perfecting Sound Forever, because ultimately Perfecting Sound Forever is about this idea that we'll never, ever reach about the perfect sound. What is the perfect record? That'll never be satisfied. And in a way, what I saw with Pinpoint was like trying to solve this age-old idea of like, what does it mean to be somewhere? Like, what does here and there mean, and how do we define that? And so it's a very powerful thing, being able to do that. So in a way, it's also its own sort of striving for perfection. That GPS was sort of like the pinnacle of this idea of trying to always know where you are and define where you are. So it kind of tapped that little part of my brain that had also been enthusiastic about Perfecting Sound Forever. So I tell people I really see them as companion books in a way.
Yeah, I can sort of understand that. I mean, I haven't read Pinpoint yet, but I can sort of understand that thematically. And again, presumably you tackle how it may or may not be changing how we think about those things as well, because you kind of touch on that in Perfecting Sound, in terms of the way that we actually think about these things, and presumably the way that we think about, because I can remember like in the early days of sat-navs and GPS and all the rest of it, you know, you would always get people go, well, I believe in a good old map. I'll just use my map, thanks very much. And I like to know where I'm going and blah, 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 and all this kind of stuff. And that sort of very slowly has kind of just seems to have just drifted off, you know, and you're not seeing people struggling with maps in the middle of the street or, you know, when they're driving in their cars and all those kind of things. And we've become totally reliant on it, it seems.
Yeah, well, there's actually been studies. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that suggests that, you know, people under a certain age can't even read a map. Literally can't navigate through a map. They've never seen a paper. They don't really know what it means. But yeah, it was this. It was like I said. It was just kind of peeling away the layers and finding out more and more things about it that were really shocking to me. And finding out that it was, you know, really this thing that's owned by the military. I mean, I always say, you know, like if, you know, some sort of terrorist somewhere, you know, wants to get a position fixed, they're doing it, you know, courtesy of the United States Department of Defense, which is kind of but to touch on what you were saying about people saying like, well, I have a map. One of the weirdest things about GPS that I think comes out in the book is that it was developed by, you know, like someone who was an Air Force colonel who was a kind of really shocked by what he saw in Vietnam with the way bombing campaigns were just done, you know, with no precision at all.
Yeah.
Wanted to find a way to actually drop bombs better so that you would actually hit targets and not hit civilians. Mm-hmm. You know, it's in his way, he said it's a more humane form of war. But throughout the time, the years it took for him and his group to develop GPS, the Air Force tried to zero out the budget for their own program several times. And the reasoning was always like, we have lots of navigation systems. Why do we need another one? And what the people on the GPS team would say is like, well, it's not really a navigation system. It's a positioning system. It's really to know where you are. It's not, I mean, letting get you from A to B is sort of like, in a way, a fringe benefit.
A little byproduct of it.
Yeah, byproduct, exactly. So GPS is so ingrained in our lives now that it's hard to believe that at one point it was really basically a military application, and also that lots of people in the Air Force thought it was a dumb idea.
Yeah, and now, as you say, it's become so ubiquitous. So obviously, you like to tackle these these big topics and everything else. So when you're doing this, do you, as you say, you talked about your research and everything, but do you have a I mean, it might sound obvious, but and you're probably going to go, of course I do. I don't just go off writing blindly. But do you kind of have a plan before you start in terms of an arc of where you want it to go? Do you kind of have an end point in your mind, or does that kind of develop as you're going through the project?
I try to at least start off with the idea of a narrative arc. For one thing, it's got a very practical use in that, writing nonfiction books, you don't have to write the whole book before a publisher says, hey, I like that idea, let's do it. But you do have to write a proposal, usually. And the proposal is a funny process because, in a way, you kind of have to fake that you know more than you already do. Mm-hmm. And the people reading the proposal know that as well. But it's this sort of...
You play the game.
Yeah, everyone's sort of playing this game. So if you can present something as an arc of some sort, that, as a story, everybody loves narrative. That's, one thing. We're all sort of addicted to it for reasons that are probably complex in terms of culture and psychology. But so if you can sort of start off with the suggestion of a narrative arc, it really helps. It changes, throughout the book, but I feel like it really, really helps. I mean, it's funny because I was trying to sell this other book that I could not sell the idea, so I kind of gave up. That was going to be about the history of the idea of the uncanny valley, which, real brief is about the idea that the more lifelike an artificial life form is, like a robot, the more lifelike it becomes, the more you empathize with it, until it becomes so lifelike that it's disconcertingly lifelike because it's not quite like real. And then so that concept has become something that's done in everything from robotics to gaming to film special effects and even reconstructive surgery. And I see that. I was thinking, okay, this would be a perfection trilogy because it would be about this idea of perfecting life in a way and trying with an imitation of life. But I couldn't sell the idea. And I in retrospect, I wonder if part of the problem was that there was, that I couldn't present it as a narrative arc. It's
because we don't know how it ends yet.
I don't know how it ends. So I mean, my advice, such as it is to nonfiction writers, is to at least start off thinking that there's a story here, not just a subject matter that's interesting, but an actual story. Even if that story can be done, even if all you can come up with is a paragraph-long abstract, it really, really helps. Because otherwise, you're risking writing a book that's only going to be of interest to, people who are already interested in the topic or academics. I mean, I really wanted both these books to be read by people who didn't even think they had an interest in the topic. Whether I was successful, I don't know. It's debatable.
You were, as far as I'm concerned. But it's funny because I have heard that before about nonfiction. Other people have said that as regards... Because, again, one of the thing about nonfiction as well, there's lots of people that I would term as they're not even writers that think they could write nonfiction. And so they pitch ideas to people, as you say. I've got an idea, even if it's just a magazine article or something. I really like gardening. I'm going to write an article about gardening. But as you've hit the nail on the head with it, because like any form of writing, whether it's an article, whether it's an essay, whatever it is, there's got to be some kind of story. There's got to be some kind of narrative to it. There's got to be an A to B of some description, not just like a bunch of facts. Because we've got that. It's called the internet.
Right. Yeah, good. Exactly. I never thought of it that way, but it's true. I mean, we have so many facts at our disposal right now.
Yeah, we've got a plethora of facts, but not that many ways of that it's been kind of crafted into a story. And the other thing as well, for me personally, I don't know whether you're the same, but when you're reading nonfiction books, the facts, if you like, and the kind of the details tend to stick more if they're in the form of a story. I would say that's the same for most people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, Rick Perlstein, who's basically made, his life's work writing about the history of the conservative movement in the United States, is really, really good at that. Of just coming up with details that, that will really stick in your mind and make you see how things connect to other things, both in the short term and in the long term. And it's something that's very, very difficult to do, I find. I mean, one piece of advice that a magazine editor once gave me was that try to make a fact in every sentence. And in a way, that's kind of like, you don't really want to do that. If every sentence was a fact, then it'd be unreadable. But the idea that every sentence should be part of a smaller whole that's leading towards something larger in connecting things together in real life. It's a difficult thing to do, and I struggle with it, but it's something that I think all nonfiction writers think about to some extent.
Yeah, and I think it's another example of the massive overlap between the two things, between fiction and nonfiction. It's the same, we often talk about, well, you don't want to wait. It's the same with scripts or anything else. You don't want to waste a line. It should be doing something. It should be propelling the story forward, or it should be telling you something about character. Well, it's a similar idea for nonfiction, presumably. It's like it should be telling you something about the central argument or the ideas that you're trying to get across, or one of the protagonists that's in it, one of you, one of the people that you're talking about. Presumably that's, when you're editing, those are the kinds of things that you should be thinking about.
Yeah, and you're also writing in this like attention deficit economy, right? I mean, around the time I started writing Pinpoint, the sort of media landscape was very different. Only a few years had gone by since I had done Perfecting Sound Forever, but I remember right at the beginning of doing that interview, in our house we got Netflix, the streaming Netflix. And that, which at the time just seemed incredible. Like this is the future. Like, look at this. It's just coming right into our homes. And I remember distinctly thinking, why would anyone read a book? And it's like, why would anyone read a book? Like, look at all this. Like, it's like right there. Like, why wouldn't you watch, remember that episode of Cheers? Let's watch that. And so I really, really feel like you just gotta, it's hard because you don't want to make it too lightweight, but if you want people to read your stuff, you're competing with a lot of different things right now. And it's really something that it can be a little bit demoralizing if you think about it too much.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. But I also think to a certain extent, I think it's kind of some of that is kind of coming back full circle in the fact that I think there's almost an overload of all that other stuff, and sometimes more and more people are trying to look for ways to unplug from a screen and get away from that side of things, and often an actual book, or a record or whatever it is that they put on is a good way to do that. So I think hopefully that's what I tell myself, because I'm an eternal optimist, but So when you're actually you're working on a project and you're writing something, so how do you actually sort of get into the zone when sitting down to write? Now, presumably when you're writing and you've got an article or you've got a deadline or something, that's relatively, it's a case of, well, you've got to do it because you can't sit around and wait for the muse. But when you're actually working on a bigger project like Perfecting Sound or Pinpoint or whatever, how do you, sit down and actually fit the work around real life, if you like?
That is a very good question, because, if what I find often happens is that, like, you start the day thinking you're going to work on this, and the day goes by and you find you haven't worked on this, and then by the afternoon you just feel worthless and pathetic.
I'm glad it's not just me.
No, it's like, I thought it was just me for a while. And so when I was working on those books, when I was working on Perfecting Sound Forever, my life was very different than it was now. I wasn't married with a kid.
Sure.
And I could live very cheaply. So the meager advance that I got for Perfecting Sound Forever, supplementing that with some freelance work I was doing, I could get by. And so every day was a sort of like trying to get into the zone, and then getting into the zone in the late afternoon, and then often like working all night. It's left to my devices. I think that's what I do. It's not the healthiest way to live, but working till like 3 a.m. and then getting up at 10 and then trying to do the whole thing over again. I got into that thing. So a lot of times getting into the zone, I find, is just a matter of like feeling really down on yourself and like why am I doing this? I can't even write a sentence. This is awful.
And when you're in that mode, have you got any like little exercises, or are there things that you do to sort of get going, sort of thing? Whether that's like, some people will write a little bit of flash fiction, or they'll come up with I don't know, whatever. Everyone's got different things that they do. It might be an exercise, or it might just be they play a piece of music, or whatever it is. Have you got anything like that, or is it literally just it gets to a point where you've just got no other choice but to start writing? The
tricky thing about nonfiction writing, as opposed to, novelists often do lots of research, but with nonfiction writing, Jonathan Franzen makes a big deal about how, when he writes, he doesn't even have the internet, and like, and he doubts anyone can write, any other way when they have the internet. If they have the internet in front of them, they're going to be distracted. And I thought of that, but I have to have the internet because even when I'm writing, I need to be able to check things and look things up and stuff. So it's weird because it's hard to get into a rhythm of writing because there's some days where you can justify not writing at all if you're just doing, the research.
Yeah.
But I mean, one trick I think is just to just write garbage, even if it's just get words down. Just think okay, before I go to sleep, I have to have 500 words or whatever. It's sometimes 500 is a good number. Doesn't matter if it's bad, just write something. Just get something down so you feel like you've had a productive, session. And even if it's hard. After all these years of writing, I still find it hard to do that. Every time I start a project, I mean, literally anything from writing an article to writing a chapter of a book, I think it feels like I've never done it before. Like, how did I ever manage to get words? It's just, so yeah, that's a little trick that I find is just to just get stuff down, even if it's almost like pretend like you're writing in a journal. Just get some things down. You'll feel better, or you'll feel less bad anyway.
And just remind yourself that you can do it.
Yeah, exactly. Especially because with nonfiction, like I said, you're not necessarily getting the rhythm of writing every day.
Yeah, because you're picking up different things when you've got the research and everything else. So as we kind of move towards wrapping things up, if you were starting again tomorrow as a totally new writer, blank slate, whatever, what, if anything, would you do differently, or what would you go back and tell your younger self?
Well, I tell my younger self, first of all, to be just to be more organized, first of all, about ideas and what you want to do, both in the short term and in the long term. Uh-huh. I would probably try to, start writing books earlier because I've only written 2, and the kind of books I tend to write just take years to do because they're so research intensive. So I would have tried to find a way to start earlier. I would have pushed a little bit more to write long form features. When I was an editor, I really felt like I could write for the New Yorker, but I was always, for example, kind of too scared to really make that leap into trying to. I think I pitched one thing. It was about Mission of Burma, weirdly, and I got rejected. I got a very nice, actual semi-personal rejection letter from David Remnick, the editor, and it felt pretty good. But yeah. And since then, I've written a couple pieces for the New Yorker, but it's taken me a long time to really. So and today there's so many places that you can write that you really just get out there and write for anything. I luckily didn't have to deal with an atmosphere of social media, because if I was starting out today, I would really make sure that I had a big social media presence, because it seems to really make a difference. If you have thousands of Twitter followers, you're just taken more seriously in a way. But I was fortunate in a sense in that landscape didn't exist, so I didn't have to worry about it. But if I were writing today, I would definitely try to, like I said, you have to. Writers are marginalized to begin with. Mm-hmm. It's just a small audience. Not many people read books; they just don't. Mm-hmm. Or magazines, for that matter. To go back to The Wire, David Simon said one of the reasons why writers love to write for TV, novelists, is because even if you're a successful novelist, let's say you have 100,000 people read your book. That's great. That's considered respectable. But that, even for the lowest rated TV show, there's going to be more people watching than that.
You're going to get canceled.
Yeah, exactly. So you have to trying to find an audience is a very, very difficult thing.
Absolutely. So you'd kind of, as you say, the biggest thing would be get started sooner.
Yeah, get started sooner. Have more confidence that, that you can do the things that you want to do. I won't even name names, but editors I know have told me certain writers that they get that are just really big name magazine writers turn in their stuff and it's just garbage. Mm-hmm. And it's amazing to hear that, because you just get the feeling writers can feel like every other writer gets it but them. Yeah. And you really have to remember that nobody knows what they're doing. I mean, honestly, none of us really know what we're doing. We're stumbling through this day to day. Writing is a crazy thing. I like to say that, what makes writing hard is that ideas and experiences are basically analog. Whereas writing is digital. Writing is basically distilling these things down into a code, words that try to make sense of life, and it often doesn't work at all. It's a crazy thing that we try to do.
Absolutely. It's a magic trick, as Stephen King describes it. He's basically, you're creating something in your mind that then gets transferred directly into someone else's mind, and you don't ever really know whether what you see is what they see. It's usually not.
Yeah, that's why in a way, like I find what novelists do to be amazing. Maybe someday I'll try it, because they really start from scratch in a way. I feel like as a long form nonfiction writer, at least you have the raw materials presented to you. It's hard to sometimes make them out and realize what the raw materials are, but they're out there. You know, it's a matter of making sense of them. But I hadn't heard that Stephen King quote before, and that's interesting considering, he churns out books at such a quick pace that you feel like it's funny that he still thinks of it as a magic trick. You'd think by now he'd think of it as like a factory assembly line or something.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay, well, as we kind of wrap things up, just give us a sense of, tell us maybe what's up next, if there is anything up next or that you've got in the pipeline, and also where people can find out more about you online.
Well, next is, that topic I mentioned earlier about the uncanny valley, I'm still obsessed with, and I can't seem to let it go. So I'd like to write more about that. I'm still writing about GPS. I had something come out in the New Yorker a few months ago about GPS jamming around the world, and this professor at the University of Texas at Austin has become this kind of crusader figuring it out and decoding it, and trying to explain why it's so dangerous, that GPS is so fragile. So that's what, I have a website. There's not much on it, but you can look at gregmilner.net for more information about me. I'm on Twitter. People can hit me up. So that's mainly the thing. I can see, I have a few other possible book topics in my mind, but they're so vague at this point.
You're still forming.
I would still like to someday write about Honolulu, write a sort of city of quartz, but for Honolulu, because I think it's such an odd city, and I grew up in it, and I think it's so unique. But the history that so someday I'd like to do that, but again, I can't seem to come up with $1 million ideas.
There's still plenty of time, and it's obviously stuff that's just forming in the back of your mind at the moment.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's been great to talk to you, Greg. Thanks very much for your time, and for the time being, thanks for coming on Joined Up Writing.
Oh, thank you. It's been fun. Thanks for having me.
Joined up writing.
There you go. Thanks again to Greg Milner, whose books are out right now, and I'll put all of his links in the show notes over at joinedupwriting.co.uk. That's it for this week, other than me reminding you to make sure you subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcasts from, to have the podcast downloaded automatically every time. Also, remember to leave us a nice rating and review on Apple Podcasts, or a comment on YouTube or whatever, as it really helps others to find the show, or just recommend it to one of your friends. I'd really appreciate it. But otherwise, that's it for this week. Thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.